John Carter's morning ritual, coffee, newspaper, and birdsong, is rudely interrupted by the grumble of a tow truck in his gravel driveway. He set down his coffee slowly, as if the sound might vanish if he didn't react. But it didn't. The mechanical clunk of the truck's gears settling into park was soon followed by the scrape of metal on gravel and a door creaking open. John stood, the faded "World's Best Grandpa" mug still warm in his hand, and moved toward the edge of his porch. His gaze drifted briefly to the photo on the mantel inside. His late wife, Margaret, smiling in the spring light beside the very cherry-red Ford that now sat under siege. Her voice echoed faintly in memory. One day that HOA is going to try to crawl past our fence. And today, it seemed, was that day. The truck, a boxy blue rig with rust licking the corners, sat hulking in his drive, half blocking the path out. A man in his early 30s, tall and slightly round, climbed out wearing a company tee and a ball cap. He looked uncomfortable. Behind him, standing with a clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of authority, was Karen Whitmore. Even from 20 feet away, John could see the expression on her face, tight-lipped, eyebrows raised, the unmistakable look of someone enjoying their perceived control. She wore a bright green blouse that matched the overgrown pride in her posture. "Morning," John called out, his tone measured. "Is there a reason there's a tow truck in my driveway?" Karen stepped forward, adjusting her grip on the clipboard like she was about to cite a verse from Scripture. "This vehicle," she said, gesturing to the Ford with a pen, "is in direct violation of HOA visual uniformity standards. It's unsightly and lowers the aesthetic cohesion of the block." John raised an eyebrow. "That's my truck," he said plainly, "and this is my driveway. Not under HOA jurisdiction." Karen didn't flinch. "Visual lines don't end with property lines, Mr. Carter. The neighborhood has standards. That thing," she pointed with her pen, "hasn't moved in weeks. It's becoming an eyesore." John leaned a hand on the porch railing. "It's a 1970 F-100, fully restored, not a rust heap. And again, my property's outside your association." The tow truck driver, Earl, according to the patch on his chest, looked between them, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. John stepped off the porch, walking slowly toward the standoff. As he reached the gravel, he pulled a folded document from his back pocket and handed it to Earl. "County zoning map, laminated. See that red line? My place is just beyond it. Not a member. Never signed the charter." Earl squinted at the paper, then glanced at Karen. "Ma'am, he's saying he's not under your HOA." Karen snatched the paper, barely glancing at it. "It doesn't matter. That vehicle offends the sightline of the community. As president, I've authorized removal." John turned to Earl, pointing gently toward the "No Trespassing Private Property" sign nailed to a post just beside the driveway. A small security camera blinked above it. "You sure you want to be on camera towing private property without a legal order?" Earl's face paled. He scratched his head. "Look, I just go where they tell me." John folded his arms. "You touch that truck, and I'll be calling Sheriff Barnes. He doesn't like being dragged into HOA." Overreach Karen's jaw tightened. "Do what you must," she said curtly, "but this isn't over." Then she spun on her heel, her heels crunching the gravel like punctuation. Earl lingered awkwardly before climbing back into his cab and starting the engine. As he backed out, he rolled down his window. "Sorry, sir. Didn't know." John nodded once. "No harm done." "Not yet." As the truck rumbled away, a few heads ducked behind curtains across the street. The town wasn't big, but word traveled fast, and this would make its rounds before lunch. He stood for a moment, letting the warmth of the morning soak into his flannel, then turned and headed back inside. Inside, the house still smelled faintly of Margaret's old rose soap. He poured a fresh cup of coffee, walked to the small console table near the door, and opened the laptop. The porch camera feed popped up, time-stamped and clear. He rewound the footage, watching Karen's stance, her gestures, the tow truck's slow arrival and departure. He saved the clip with deliberate keystrokes, naming the folder. HOA, Evidence. John sat back and sipped his coffee. The birds had returned to the feeder. The porch creaked in the breeze. But something in the air had changed, like the first roll of thunder on a blue sky day. And he knew it wasn't going to stop with just a clipboard. A folded letter appears in John's mailbox. Notice of violation, vehicle non-compliance. The envelope was crisp, white, and oddly official-looking. No return address, just a bold header and a seal that seemed suspiciously downloaded off a clipart site. John turned it over once, then twice, before sliding a finger beneath the flap. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore printed text in what looked like a Word document template, filled with vague terms like community standards, aesthetic harmony, and visual dissonance. It wasn't signed. No HOA board member name, no contact info, just the words, "Immediate removal required." He exhaled slowly, the edge of the letter curling slightly in his fingers. He turned on his heel and stepped back inside, placing the paper carefully on his kitchen counter. The sunlight caught on the edge of the mug he hadn't finished from this morning. His cherry-red Ford still sat proudly in the drive, untouched since yesterday's standoff. He opened a drawer, pulled out a fresh legal pad, and wrote across the top in deliberate block letters, "Karen file." Then he added, "June 6th, unsigned violation notice Ford truck, letter left in mailbox." No HOA authority, saved camera footage. Beside it, he drew a small box and checked it with a pencil, his quiet way of confirming, "This is being handled." A half-hour later, he walked across the street with a pie plate wrapped in foil, cradled in his arms. It was technically Helen's pie, but she always sent him home with a slice after a good conversation. The late afternoon sun filtered through budding oaks as he reached her porch. Lace curtains drifted lazily behind the screen door, and from inside a familiar voice called out, "It's open, John." He stepped inside to find Helen Parker, 75 and still sharp as a tack, setting out 2 plates on a small table by the window. She smiled, warm and knowing. "You got a letter, didn't you?" John raised an eyebrow as he sat. "You hear everything on this block?" "Only the stuff worth hearing," she said, handing him a fork. "Karen's been itching for a target ever since the Petersons got that wind chime she hated." John chuckled softly and took a bite. The lemon filling was tangy, smooth, and just the right amount of sweet. "I checked the wording," he said between bites. "It's not even signed. She must have typed it herself. The HOA has no say over my property." Helen leaned back in her chair. "Never stopped her before? You remember when she told Mrs. Henderson she couldn't hang a flag because it clashed with the shutters?" "I do," he said, and Henderson painted the shutters red the next week. They sat for a while, letting the pie do the talking. Outside, a radio crackled with a farm update, soybean prices down, early heat wave coming through Missouri. Finally, John stood and dusted off his hands. "I'm heading to City Hall," he said. "Time to get this on record." It was a short drive to the Sycamore Ridge Municipal Building, a 1-story structure with a faded mural of the town's founding painted above the door. Inside, he was greeted by a thin man in his 50s with a gentle voice and an easy patience. Inspector Davis. John laid out the laminated zoning map and his deed on the desk. Davis studied both carefully, nodding along. "She really tried to issue a notice for that truck?" he asked. John slid the letter across the table. "No name, no legitimacy. Just bullying dressed up as bureaucracy." Davis stood. "Let's go take a look." Back at the property, Davis walked the perimeter slowly, nodding, pointing to the red-painted boundary markers and occasionally jotting notes in a small pad. "You're in the clear," he said at last. "HOA doesn't own air rights to your front yard." John smiled, offering a quiet thanks. Davis lingered a moment. "Between you and me," he added, glancing toward the corner of the block, "she's on thin ice." As the inspector pulled away, John felt a ripple of something unexpected. Not relief exactly, but a small breath of progress. He returned inside, added the visit to the Karen file, then turned on his printer. The cease and desist letter he'd drafted the night before rolled out clean and crisp. He slipped in a copy of the camera footage on a USB and sealed the envelope. Before dinner, he walked it to the post office himself. As twilight settled, he stood once more on his porch, now with a fresh notepad in hand. The street was quiet save for a few kids riding bikes near the corner. Then a soft voice reached his ear. "Mr. Carter?" He looked up to see Rebecca Lynn, late 30s, thoughtful eyes, arms crossed as she stood at the edge of his fence. "Just wanted to say, you're not the only one," she said. "Karen's left 2 notes on my door about my son's hammock. Called it a hazardous structure. He's 10. John gave a slow nod. "Thanks for telling me." "I didn't speak up before," she admitted. "But maybe I will now." She turned and walked back across the street, the porch light flicking on behind her as she stepped inside. Later that night, long after the crickets had begun their evening chorus, John sat in the dark of his living room with only the glow of his laptop for company. The porch camera feed was still rolling, recording the quiet world outside. Suddenly, a motion alert popped up. He clicked it open, the feed sharpening into focus. Karen's SUV had pulled up again, only this time she wasn't on his property. She was parked just across the line, wheels nudging the edge of the public easement, her headlights trained squarely at his truck. Karen returns Wednesday morning, this time with 2 police officers and her own smirk of satisfaction. The sound of tires crunching over gravel had become far too familiar. John Carter looked up from his porch, steam rising from the mug in his hand, and caught sight of the same SUV idling by the curb. This time, Karen didn't come alone. She stepped out of the vehicle first, clipboard under her arm, blouse starched to perfection, that same glint of self-righteousness in her eye. Behind her, 2 uniformed officers emerged from a cruiser, one tall and steady, the other stockier but younger, surveying the street with cautious eyes. Officer Ramirez and Officer Temple, their badges catching the morning light. John sat back slowly, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. He could almost hear Karen's voice from earlier in the week. "You'll hear from us again." Well, she was nothing if not punctual. From his vantage point, he could see a small gathering forming across the street, neighbors stepping out with coffee in hand, a few even dragging folding chairs into place as if they'd sensed a performance coming. Tom Jensen, retired mechanic and longtime neighbor, nodded once in John's direction, but said nothing, just watched. Karen marched confidently to the front of John's driveway and gestured grandly toward his truck. "This vehicle," she announced, her voice loud enough to carry, "continues to disrupt visual harmony and neighborhood unity. I've submitted multiple complaints, and the homeowner refuses to comply. I am requesting removal under civic nuisance provisions." Officer Temple looked from the truck to John's porch. "Sir?" John stood, not rushed, not irritated, just steady. He walked down the steps, a man used to standing in storms without an umbrella. "I have paperwork," he said, producing the now well-worn laminated map and a printed copy of his HOA exclusion letter. "And footage. The property's outside HOA boundaries, the truck's legally parked, registered, and fully operational." Karen huffed. "It's immobile. It hasn't moved in days." "I haven't gone to town," John said evenly. "Didn't realize that was now a crime." Ramirez took the papers, flipping through with a practiced eye. Temple pulled out a tablet and checked parcel records against the county's zoning map. After a moment, Temple nodded. "He's right. This lot's outside your HOA footprint, ma'am. You can't enforce HOA standards here." Karen's lips tightened, But before she could launch into another tirade, a calm voice from across the street cut in. "Her Lexus is on the easement again," Tom said, not even looking up from his thermos. Karen's head snapped toward her vehicle. "That's not relevant." Ramirez turned. "Is that true?" John remained silent, letting the officers do their work. Officer Temple walked across to the SUV, radioed something to dispatch, then came back. "It's registered to a private resident, not a municipal or service vehicle," he said. "And she's parked over the marked drainage line. That's city property." Karen's face paled. "I didn't know." Ramirez raised a hand. "Ma'am, municipal code is very clear. No parking on easements or obstructing storm runoff lines. That includes residents." Earl, the same tow truck driver from 2 days ago, stood beside his truck, eyes wide. "Wait, you want me to tow her car?" Temple nodded. "You've got the paperwork now." Karen stepped forward, eyes blazing. "That's my car." Ramirez didn't flinch. "Then you should have followed the rules." It took only seconds for Earl to lower the winch and begin the slow, clinking process of hauling up the front tires. Karen stood beside the officers, sputtering protests, hands flailing as neighbors murmured from their lawns. John said nothing, just walked back up to his porch, filled his mug from the still-warm thermos, and sat. Earl finished the job and climbed into the cab. Karen's Lexus, now lifted and locked, rolled slowly down the street, the back of the truck bouncing slightly over the uneven pavement. Karen remained frozen in place, the wind catching her hair, eyes locked on John. "This isn't over." She spat the words like a curse, every syllable jagged. John didn't respond, but the camera above his porch blinked quietly, recording everything. A thick manila envelope arrives in John's mailbox. Final notice, $500 fine for community disruption. He didn't even have to open it to know where it came from. The oversized final notice, printed in bold, blocky letters on the front, was the kind of thing that screamed drama more than it whispered law. John turned it over once in his hands before walking back toward the house, the morning sun just beginning to spill across the porch. Inside, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and sugar. Helen had dropped off a small plate of rolls not 20 minutes earlier, still warm in the dish towel she used for everything from potlucks to funerals. "You handled her well," she'd said with a wink, setting the plate down like it were a badge of honor. Now they sat in the center of his table, steam rising faintly as sunlight glowed across the wood grain. John slid the letter from the envelope and read. The citation was nearly identical to the last, except this one claimed to be a final warning, included a fine amount, and still bore no signature. It referenced Community Harmony Article 12B, which, to John's knowledge, didn't exist in any official code. He flipped it over. Blank. No name. No board member initials. Just the same lazy formatting Karen always used when she wanted something to look more threatening than it was. He set the letter beside the cinnamon rolls, opened his spiral notebook, and wrote, June 8th, $500 fine arrives. Unsigned. Citation references non-existent. HOA article. He took one bite of a roll, fluffy, still warm, icing just starting to harden, then stood and grabbed his keys. The HOA office was a modest brick building on the edge of town, sandwiched between a dental clinic and a realty office. Inside, it smelled of toner and faintly old carpet. A single desk with a small brass plaque reading Linda Garcia, admin secretary, sat behind a glass partition. Linda looked up as he walked in, her fingers still poised above a keyboard. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." "Linda," he said, offering a polite nod. "I received a rather dramatic envelope this morning." Her lips twitched into something between a smile and a wince. "Another letter?" He set the citation down in front of her. She leaned forward, scanned it, and tapped the corner with her index finger. "That's not an official HOA-issued fine. "Thought so," John said. "Is Karen still submitting these on her own?" Linda glanced toward the hallway, then back at him. "Technically, anything not reviewed and signed by a board majority isn't enforceable." "Technically?" John repeated. She hesitated. Then, with a sigh, reached into a file drawer and pulled out a folder labeled Violations, Whitmore. She slid it across the counter without a word. Inside were copies of complaint letters Karen had filed over the past 6 months, many of them targeting the same handful of residents. Flags, kids' toys and yards, lawn furniture, holiday lights hung, past seasonal allowance. It was a trail of paper pettiness. "Mind if I borrow these?" John asked. "I didn't see anything," Linda said quietly, returning to her keyboard. Back home, Tom and Rebecca were already waiting on the porch. "I hear the mailman brought fireworks," Tom said, sipping from a chipped thermos. John motioned them inside. At the table, he spread the file out and began sorting the letters by date and resident. Helen arrived a few minutes later with more rolls, her presence gentle but grounding. "That flag notice Karen gave me?" she said, pulling a yellowing paper from her purse. "It's from 3 years ago. Said I couldn't fly the American flag on Memorial Day." John took it carefully, adding it to the growing pile. "We're building a case," he said, "but not just for me, for everyone." By late afternoon, they had 6 accounts. John sat at his desk, typing steadily. The complaint letter grew from a few paragraphs to 12 pages. It included photos, copies of notices, timestamps from his camera footage, and sworn neighbor statements. When it was finished, he printed 4 copies. One went into an envelope addressed to the City Oversight Committee, one to the Sycamore Ridge Gazette, one to the HOA Board, minus Karen, and the last stayed with him. He stood in the doorway just before sunset, envelopes in hand, watching the street settle into the hush of evening. Kids kicked at stray soccer balls. Porch lights flickered on. The town felt watchful, not tense, but aware. That night, as he sat on his porch once again, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee, he saw movement across the street. Karen was pacing, back and forth on her lawn, phone pressed tightly to her ear, voice rising and falling like a woman trying to keep control of a conversation that was quickly escaping her. Her Lexus was still gone. Her posture was more rigid than usual, one hand slicing the air with every sharp word. John said nothing. He simply leaned back in his chair, reached for his notebook, and added one more line. June 8th, Karen pacing. Phone call, car still impounded. The notice is posted. Emergency HOA Town Meeting, Friday 6 p.m., Sycamore Hall, open to all residents. By the time John spotted the flyer tacked to the bulletin board at the post office, half the town had already heard. Sycamore Ridge wasn't the kind of place that waited for news to travel. It moved on whispers and potluck tables. The flyer was printed in bold font with unnecessary urgency, like a weather alert for a drizzle. Tom stood beside him, squinting at the sign. "Last time they called an emergency meeting," he murmured. "It was about raccoons in the dumpsters." John folded his arms. "This time, it's about something meaner than raccoons." Sycamore Hall had once been a small chapel. Now it served as the town's one-size-fits-all gathering space, birthday parties, quilting groups, the occasional town council election. On this Friday evening, the place was lit up, folding chairs in neat rows, the air carrying the scent of lemon cleaner and old hymnals. A table near the back held a coffee urn, a tray of deviled eggs, and what looked suspiciously like Helen's banana bread. John entered quietly, nodding at Helen, who sat beside Rebecca and Tom in the 3rd row. Linda Garcia hovered near the back, eyes darting nervously. Karen stood at the front, dressed in a tailored blazer and pearls, clipboard in hand. She smiled in that rehearsed way politicians do when they sense they're losing the crowd but haven't accepted it yet. "Good evening," she said into the squeaky microphone. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to reestablish a sense of unity in our neighborhood. There has been confusion, and I'd like to clarify where we stand." John waited. Karen continued, waxing poetic about order, visual cohesion, and the soul of Sycamore Ridge. She hadn't said his name, but she didn't need to. When she finally gestured to the crowd and asked if anyone wished to speak, John rose. No fanfare, no raised voice, just a man with a folder in hand and purpose in his step. "I'd like a few minutes," he said. Karen smiled tightly. "Of course." John turned to the room. "Most of you know me. I've lived on the ridge for 12 years. I've restored my truck, my porch, and my late wife's rose bushes with the same care. What you may not know is that my home lies outside HOA boundaries. I am not, and have never been, subject to its rules." A few murmurs passed through the room. He opened the folder and pulled out the printed map, holding it up. "Here's my property line, certified by the county. Here are the letters I've received, unsigned and with fabricated rules. Here's the footage from my porch camera showing Karen attempting to tow my truck without authority. And this," he held up a statement, "is from Inspector Davis, confirming no HOA jurisdiction." He paused. "But this isn't just about me." Helen stood next. She moved slowly, a printed sheet in hand. 3 years ago, I was told to take down my flag on Memorial Day. Karen said it clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. I have the note." She handed the paper to Linda, who read it silently and gave a small nod. Then Rebecca stood, her voice tight. "She took photos of my kids, playing in our own yard, said their hammock violated safety protocols." One by one, neighbors rose, a story about a garden gnome, a threat over wind chimes, a fine for a planter box too close to the curb. Each tale painted the same picture, control masquerading as concern. Finally, Linda stepped forward. She held a folder, hands shaking slightly. "I work in the HOA office," she said, "and I need to say this. Most of these complaints," she gestured to the growing pile, "were submitted by Karen without board approval. They were not reviewed, and they weren't filed through proper channels." The room fell silent. Karen's smile had vanished. Mr. Palmer, the HOA president, adjusted his glasses. "Karen, would you like to respond?" Karen stood straighter, her voice sharp. "This neighborhood is slipping. You're all letting standards slide. John flaunted his truck like a badge of rebellion. He's a threat to order." Her voice rose. "If we don't hold the line, we lose what makes Sycamore Ridge better." But the room no longer nodded along. John said nothing. He just turned back to his seat and quietly thanked Rebecca as she sat down. Helen passed him a folded sheet of paper, her timeline of Karen's violations typed and highlighted. Mr. Palmer stepped forward, clearing his throat. "The board will deliberate in private," he said. "Expect an official decision by Sunday." Sunday morning. A printed notice is posted on the HOA bulletin board. Karen Whitmore removed from position of president, effective immediately. John Carter spotted it on his morning walk. It was taped to the corkboard beside the post office window, next to flyers for piano lessons and missing cats. The type was plain, the wording unceremonious. No embellishments, no "thank you for your service." Just one sentence that felt, somehow, louder than any speech Karen had ever given. Back at his porch, sunlight warmed the floorboards, and the hum of cicadas hinted at a summer on its way. Birds chirped in the oak trees, and a boy across the street bounced a basketball in steady rhythm. John leaned against the porch post, mug in hand, and thought of something his father used to say. "Some storms don't pass. Sometimes you gotta outlast 'em." This morning felt like sunshine after weeks of thunder. By mid-morning, a manila envelope arrived with a soft thud in the mailbox. Inside was a formal letter from the HOA board, signed by Mr. Palmer and 2 other members, acknowledging the overreach, retracting all prior citations against him, and offering a lifetime exemption from HOA fees as a gesture of good faith. Tucked behind it was a smaller envelope, a check made out to John Carter, reimbursing past fines and administrative fees he had never agreed to. He smiled faintly and placed it in the kitchen drawer, beside a stack of unopened coupons and Margaret's old recipe cards. Across the street, Karen was packing. A rented moving truck sat in her driveway, its ramp extended like a white flag. She moved mechanically, cardboard boxes stacked in the entryway, a painting wrapped in plastic. Her eyes never met his. She didn't wave, didn't say goodbye. The house that once watched like a lighthouse now stood dim and empty. The scent of barbecue began drifting down the block by late afternoon. Lawn chairs appeared like mushrooms after rain. Kids zigzagged between sprinklers, and the old red and white checkered tablecloth made its return to Helen's folding table. John brought coleslaw, same as every year. He didn't cook much, but he could shred cabbage like a pro. Someone taped a hand-drawn sign to the trellis near the pie table. Big block letters in blue crayon. "Thank you, John." Helen handed him a lemonade and nudged his arm. "You look lighter." "Feels lighter," he admitted. Neighbors gathered under the shade trees. Tom arrived in boots and a sun hat, grinning. Rebecca brought a peach cobbler, and her son wore a shirt that read, "Team Carter." Linda lingered near the deviled eggs, chatting softly. As the sun dipped low, Mr. Palmer approached with a small envelope and an open hand. "You didn't just defend yourself," he said. "You reminded us how communities are supposed to work." John took the envelope, shook his hand. "I just didn't like being pushed around." Rebecca, Helen, and Tom raised their glasses. Tea, lemonade, something stronger. "To the man who remembered what fairness feels like," Helen said. John shook his head, chuckling. "I didn't win anything. We just stopped losing." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The music, some old country tune, picked back up. Paper plates piled high, kids chased fireflies, and for the first time in a long time, the air didn't feel tight. Later, after the last casserole was packed into Tupperware and the lawn chairs folded up, John returned home. The porch creaked as he stepped up, and he noticed the familiar groan of the third step. Same as always. He fetched his toolkit and tightened the screw. Just one step, but it felt like settling the whole house back into place. He stood for a moment, gazing across the yard to where his Ford truck gleamed under the porch light, unchanged and unmoved through all the nonsense. It had stayed. So had he. Tom called from the sidewalk, holding a to-go plate. "Ever thought about running for HOA?" John grinned, eyes on the truck. "Not a chance." On a quiet street in Sycamore Ridge, one man's porch became the front line between decency and control. What began with a truck and a clipboard ended with a community finding its voice, and a bully finally silenced. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about shouting louder, but holding firm while others remember their strength. Like old fence posts weathering the wind, real change comes when neighbors lean on each other, and in the end, it's not the noise that lasts. It's the roots we protect.